Sometimes, the loudest cry for help is the one the wind almost buries beneath the dust. The canyon had swallowed better people than her. Aiyana Red Hawk knew that long before the first stone gave way beneath her feet. The narrow ledge she clung to was barely wider than a saddle, pressed against a wall of crimson rock polished smooth by centuries of rain that rarely came. Below, jagged boulders waited in silence, their sharp edges glowing beneath the afternoon sun like broken blades. One slip would end everything before nightfall ever reached the valley. She tightened her bleeding fingers around a stubborn root protruding from the cliff face. Dirt crumbled beneath her nails. The root groaned. Not much longer. The smell of hot sandstone mixed with the faint scent of sage carried upward by the restless wind. Somewhere above, vultures circled with patient confidence. They always seemed to know before anyone else. Aiyana closed her eyes for only a heartbeat. Not because she feared dying. Because she refused to let the last thing she saw be the empty sky. Only an hour earlier she had been riding through Raven Pass, trying to outrun 4 men who cared more about silver than justice. They weren't soldiers. They weren't lawmen. They were bounty hunters wearing respectability like borrowed coats, chasing an Apache woman because powerful men had promised generous rewards for her capture. Alive or dead, it hardly mattered. The horse had stumbled when loose rocks thundered down the slope. She remembered the violent fall, the terrified scream of the animal disappearing into the ravine, and the crushing silence afterward. Now she was alone, or so she believed. A pebble bounced somewhere high above. Then another. Her dark eyes lifted toward the rim of the canyon. Nothing. Only blinding sunlight. She listened. Wind. Silence. Then, the unmistakable rhythm of hoofbeats. 1 horse. Not 4. Steady. Unhurried. Whoever approached wasn't chasing anyone. Aiyana's pulse quickened anyway. Sometimes one rider was more dangerous than 20. The shadow appeared first. Long distorted. Stretching across the rocks until a broad-brimmed hat blocked the burning sun overhead. She instinctively reached toward the knife that was no longer hanging from her belt. Gone. Lost in the fall. A man's silhouette stood above the ledge. Tall. Motionless. He didn't point a rifle. He didn't shout. For several endless seconds, neither of them spoke. The stranger slowly removed his gloves before kneeling near the edge. Weathered hands rested on the stone as calm gray eyes searched the narrow shelf where she struggled to remain alive. He noticed the torn Apache clothing, the blood on her palms, the fear she fought so hard to hide. His expression never changed. Most white men looked at Apache women with suspicion, some with hatred, others with triumph. This man looked at her as though he had simply found another human being caught between life and death. The silence became strangely heavier than words. Far above them, another sound drifted across the canyon. More horses. This time, several. The cowboy heard them too. His head turned only slightly toward the distant ridge where tiny clouds of dust had begun rising against the horizon. He understood something before she ever spoke. Someone was coming, and they weren't looking for him. He looked back into her exhausted eyes. His voice, when it finally broke the silence, was low enough to disappear into the wind. I'm going to pull you up. Aiyana's breath caught. You'll regret it, she whispered. The cowboy studied her for one quiet moment before giving the smallest shake of his head. No. His hand reached down across the empty air. I reckon the men riding this way will regret getting here first. The strongest ropes were not always made of hemp. Sometimes they were woven from fear, memory, and the lies people chose to believe. Elias Brooks stretched himself flat against the warm stone, his boots digging into the canyon rim as he reached farther than any sensible man should. Take my wrist, he said. Aiyana didn't move. She had seen white men offer hands before. Some pulled people to safety. Others dragged them into chains. Dust swirled between them, carried by a restless wind that smelled of dry sage and sun-baked earth. The canyon seemed to hold its breath. I won't ask again, Elias said quietly. Not because he lacked patience, because the riders were getting closer. The distant hoofbeats echoed from the cliffs, no longer faint enough to mistake for thunder. Aiyana looked beyond him toward the horizon. Thin trails of dust rose above the ridge. For riders. Exactly as she feared. She swallowed the bitterness in her throat. If she stayed, the bounty hunters would find her. If she trusted him, she might simply die another way. Her fingers released the stubborn root. For one terrifying heartbeat, there was nothing beneath her except empty air. Then Elias caught her wrist. The force nearly pulled him over the edge. His shoulder slammed against the rock with a dull crack. Pain shot through his arm, but his grip never loosened. "Climb," he grunted. Aiyana found another hold with her free hand. Her moccasins scraped against loose sandstone as pebbles tumbled into the abyss below. Elias leaned backward inch by inch, using his own weight instead of brute strength. Sweat rolled beneath the brim of his hat, disappearing into the dust covering his weathered face. Finally, her hand reached solid ground. Together they collapsed onto the canyon floor above, breathing hard without looking at one another. For several seconds neither spoke. The silence carried more honesty than conversation ever could. Then Elias rose first. He brushed dirt from his coat, retrieved the Winchester resting against a nearby boulder, and glanced toward the approaching dust cloud. They're less than 10 minutes behind. Aiyana stood carefully despite the bruises spreading across her ribs. "You should leave." "So should you. They're hunting me." "I figured. They'll kill anyone helping me." He slid another cartridge into the rifle with practiced hands. "I figured that too." She stared at him, unable to understand. Why? The single word lingered between them. Why risk everything? Why save an Apache woman? Why choose trouble when peace was still possible? Elias rested the rifle across his shoulder. "My father used to say a person's blood tells you where they came from." His gray eyes settled calmly on hers. "But it doesn't tell you whether they're worth saving." Rifle shot shattered the stillness. The bullet struck the rocks beside them, spraying sharp fragments across the narrow trail. Another shot followed. Closer. "They found us," one harsh voice shouted from somewhere below. "There." Elias seized Aiyana's arm, not roughly, only firmly enough to pull her into motion. "This way." They disappeared between towering walls of red stone, just as two more bullets ricocheted behind them. The canyon twisted like a maze carved by forgotten rivers. Sunlight vanished beneath towering cliffs, replaced by cool shadows smelling of damp stone and ancient earth. Their footsteps echoed together. Cowboy, Apache, two strangers running toward the same uncertain horizon. After nearly a mile, Elias suddenly stopped. Ahead stood a narrow military checkpoint built across the only pass leading north. An American flag fluttered lazily above rough timber barricades. Blue-coated cavalry soldiers watched every traveler entering the valley. Aiyana's face lost what little color remained. "If they see me," she whispered. Elias studied the checkpoint, then looked back at the dust cloud growing behind them. Bounty hunters from one side, soldiers from the other. The trap had simply become larger. His eyes dropped to the coil of rope hanging from his saddle, then to the torn leather straps fastened around Aiyana's wrists from her fall. A slow idea formed behind his calm expression. "Listen carefully," he said. "When we reach that gate." He pulled another length of rope free. "You're not an Apache woman anymore." He tightened the knot around her wrists just enough to fool anyone watching. "You're my prisoner." The most dangerous disguise was not the rope around her wrists. It was the lie both of them were about to tell. The military checkpoint stood across the canyon pass like an old scar that refused to heal. Rough pine logs formed a barricade, while two faded Union flags stirred lazily in the afternoon wind. Soldiers leaned against the fence with rifles resting across their shoulders, their blue coats dusty from months beneath the relentless western sun. No one smiled. Out here, strangers were measured before they were welcomed. Elias slowed his horse as they approached. Aiyana walked beside him, her wrists bound with rope, her chin lowered just enough to play the part. The knots looked convincing, though she knew she could free herself in seconds if she wished. She hated every step, not because of the rope, because pretending to be helpless felt worse than captivity itself. A cavalry sergeant stepped into the road. His thick mustache twitched as sharp gray eyes settled first on Elias, then on the Apache woman beside him. "Afternoon." Elias tipped his hat. "Afternoon." The sergeant spat into the dust. "Where'd you find her?" "Near Raven Pass." "She's one of them?" "So she says." The soldier circled Aiyana slowly, studying the torn fabric of her dress, the dried blood on her hands, the dust covering her face. His expression carried the familiar mixture of suspicion and quiet contempt she had endured her entire life. She refused to look away. Even prisoners deserved dignity. "Mean look in her eyes," another soldier muttered. "They all got that look." Aiyana felt the words strike harder than any fist. Elias heard them too. He said nothing. Not yet. The sergeant folded his arms. You bringing her to Fort Clayton? That's the plan. Mind if we take her off your hands? The question hung in the air. Behind them, faint echoes of approaching hoofbeats drifted through the canyon. Closer now. The bounty hunters were still coming. Elias glanced casually over his shoulder before returning his attention to the sergeant. I've got papers waiting on the reward. The sergeant frowned. What reward? For the first time since meeting him, Aiyana saw uncertainty flicker across Elias's face. Only for a heartbeat. Then it vanished. Merchant named Gideon Mercer posted it in Red Hollow. The sergeant scratched his beard. Haven't heard about that. He pays in gold. That changed everything. Several soldiers exchanged quick glances. Gold always traveled faster than the truth. The sergeant stepped aside, though something in his expression remained unsettled. You'd better hurry. Elias nodded once. I intend to. He gathered the reins and started forward. They had almost crossed the barricade when a voice thundered from behind. Hold it. Everyone turned. For riders burst from the canyon trail in clouds of red dust. The bounty hunters. Their horses were lathered with sweat. The man leading them wore a long black coat despite the heat. A jagged scar cut across his cheek like a bolt of lightning frozen in flesh. He pointed directly at Aiyana. That woman belongs to us. The soldiers instinctively reached for their rifles. The scarred rider dismounted before his horse had fully stopped. We've tracked her for 2 days. His eyes shifted toward Elias. And that cowboy stole our prize. Silence spread across the checkpoint. The sergeant looked from one group to the other. You got proof. The bounty hunter reached inside his coat and unfolded a weathered sheet bearing an official-looking seal. From where she stood, Aiyana could not read the words. But she recognized the symbol burned into the wax. A silver wolf. Her heartbeat froze. She had seen that mark once before. Not on a bounty notice. On the ledger belonging to the man who had ordered her father's murder. She lowered her eyes before anyone noticed the fear crossing her face. This was never about collecting rewards. Someone powerful wanted her captured before she could tell the truth. The sergeant studied the document while Elias remained perfectly still. One hand rested near his revolver, not touching it, waiting. Then the sergeant slowly looked up. His voice carried a warning colder than the mountain wind. Seems one of you gentlemen is lying. And for the first time that day, Elias realized the rope around Aiyana's wrists might not be enough to save either of them. Truth rarely arrived carrying a badge. More often, it rode into town wearing the same dust as every other liar. The canyon checkpoint fell silent. Even the horses seemed to sense that one wrong word could spill blood across the road. Sergeant Nolan held the folded document beneath the afternoon light. His weathered eyes moved slowly across the page while the scarred bounty hunter waited with folded arms and the confidence of a man accustomed to being believed. Elias never reached for his revolver. Neither did the hunters. Everyone understood that the first hand touching a weapon would decide how the day ended. Nolan finally lowered the paper. It says she's wanted for murder. Aiyana felt the words settle over the checkpoint like cold ash. Murder. Not theft. Not trespassing. Murder. She kept her face still, though memories clawed their way back into her mind. The old medicine man collapsing beside the river. The fire consuming her family's winter lodge. The silver wolf stamped into fresh wagon tracks, disappearing before sunrise. Someone had rewritten history. The scarred hunter smiled. You hear that, Sergeant? Nolan nodded slowly. I heard. The hunter extended his hand. We'll take her now. Instead of answering, Nolan looked toward Elias. You've got anything to say? Elias removed his hat, brushed a layer of dust from the brim, and spoke with surprising calm. I've got one question. The sergeant raised an eyebrow. Shoot. If she's wanted for murder. Elias glanced at the bounty hunter. Why bring 4 men instead of a deputy? No one answered immediately. The wind slipped between the pine barricades, carrying the dry scent of cedar and distant rain that would never reach the valley. The scarred man's smile faded almost imperceptibly. We don't answer to deputies. I noticed. We answer to the man paying us. And who's that? Silence. Too much silence. Nolan's eyes narrowed. The bounty hunter recovered quickly. None of your concern. It became my concern when bullets started flying at my back. Another pause. Small. Heavy. Enough for doubt to enter the checkpoint. The sergeant folded the warrant again. I've never heard of Gideon Mercer issuing legal rewards. He owns half of Red Hollow. The hunter replied sharply. He doesn't own the law. The words hung between them. For the first time, the soldiers shifted their attention away from Aiyana, toward the hunters. The balance inside the checkpoint had begun to change. Then another rider appeared. Alone. His horse stumbled from exhaustion before stopping outside the barricade. The newcomer wore the dusty clothes of a freight courier. His face was pale. Bodies. He gasped. 3 miles south. Everyone turned. What happened? The courier swallowed hard. Wagon attacked. The bounty hunter interrupted. Apaches. The courier shook his head. No. He pointed directly toward the scarred man. Those men. The checkpoint froze. They robbed the shipment. The courier continued between heavy breaths. I hid beneath the wagon. His trembling finger never left the bounty hunters. I saw everything. One of the hunters instinctively reached toward his rifle. Too late. Half a dozen cavalry carbines snapped upward in perfect unison. Hands. Sergeant Nolan barked. The road exploded into motion. The hunters hesitated only a heartbeat before wheeling their horses around. Ride. Hooves thundered against the packed earth. Rifles cracked. Dust burst into the air. One outlaw tumbled from his saddle. The others disappeared into the maze of crimson cliffs before the smoke had cleared. Silence returned almost as quickly as it had vanished. Only drifting gunpowder lingered beneath the afternoon sun. Nolan slowly lowered his rifle. His eyes settled on Aiyana, then on the loose rope around her wrists. Without saying a word, he stepped forward, drew his knife, and sliced through the bindings. The fibers fell into the dust. Aiyana rubbed her wrists, uncertain whether she was truly free. I owe you an apology, Nolan said quietly. She studied him for a long moment. You owe me nothing. I judged you before hearing your story. No. Her voice remained calm. You judged my face before hearing my name. The words struck harder than any bullet fired that afternoon. Even the soldiers lowered their eyes. Nolan removed his campaign hat. I won't make that mistake again. Before anyone could answer, the exhausted courier reached into his saddlebag. I almost forgot. He pulled out 3 weathered objects wrapped inside an old canvas cloth. A bloodstained blue bandana, a tarnished silver necklace engraved with an unfamiliar symbol, and a folded letter, its edges blackened by fire. I found these in the burned wagon. Aiyana stared at the silver necklace. The color drained from her face. She recognized it instantly. It had belonged to her father. Then memories. They left the kind of truth that living men would kill to bury. No one spoke as Aiyana took the silver necklace into her trembling hands. Years of dust coated the engraved pendant, but the carving remained unmistakable. An eagle spreading its wings above a winding river. Her father had carved that symbol himself during a winter when snow buried the mountains and food had become scarcer than hope. She had watched him wear it every single day. She had buried him with it. Her fingers tightened until her knuckles turned pale. This is impossible, she whispered. Elias watched her carefully. You've seen it before. She nodded without lifting her eyes. It belonged to my father. The courier frowned. I found it inside the burned freight wagon. A cold silence settled over the checkpoint. Sergeant Nolan slowly unfolded the fire-scorched letter. The edges crumbled beneath his fingers, but most of the ink had survived. I can still read part of it. Everyone gathered closer. The sergeant cleared his throat. Deliver the Apache woman alive. Destroy all remaining records. No witnesses. Payment will be completed after the necklace is recovered. The final line had nearly burned away. Only one signature remained untouched. Gideon Mercer. No one breathed for several long seconds. Elias felt something old stir inside his memory. Mercer. The name had followed cattle drives, mining camps, railroad contracts, and whispered conversations in saloons from Arizona to New Mexico. A businessman. A landowner. A man respected by judges. And feared by everyone else. Aiyana slowly looked toward the distant mountains. My father never killed anyone. Her voice was barely louder than the wind. He found something. What? Elias asked. She closed her hand around the necklace. I don't know. He never told you? He only said. Her words caught in her throat. If strangers ever come asking about the river, never answer them. The courier shifted uneasily. What river? She shook her head. I was a child. Another silence. Then Elias reached toward the blood-stained blue bandana lying across the saddle. Something about it seemed strangely familiar. He unfolded the faded cloth. Stitched into one corner were two small letters. TB. His expression changed. Sergeant Nolan noticed immediately. You know whose that is? Elias nodded slowly. Thomas Brooks. The sergeant blinked. Your father? My father. The checkpoint disappeared around him for a moment. He remembered being 12 years old, watching his father saddle a chestnut horse before sunrise. I've got business near Apache Ridge, Thomas had said with a tired smile. 3 days later, he returned home wounded, carrying little more than a torn bandana and a story he never finished. Whenever Elias asked what had happened, his father would simply answer, "Not every enemy wears war paint." The memory struck him harder than expected. His father had died 5 winters ago. He had taken the rest of that story into the grave. Until now. Elias looked from the bandana to the necklace resting in Aiyana's hands. My father knew yours. Aiyana stared at him. No. He did. He fought Apaches. My father traded horses. He was white. He judged men one at a time. Neither of them spoke after that. The wind carried the scent of distant rain across the canyon, while the evening sun painted the cliffs with deep shades of gold and crimson. Sergeant Nolan folded the letter once more. If Mercer wanted this necklace. He looked toward the western horizon where the escaped bounty hunters had vanished. Then whatever your father's discovered is worth killing for. The courier swallowed nervously. What do we do now? Elias slipped the silver necklace carefully into his coat pocket before handing it back to Aiyana. We find a river. She looked at him with cautious disbelief. You don't even know where it is. No. But someone else does. He turned towards Sergeant Nolan. You said Fort Clayton keeps old survey maps. The sergeant nodded slowly. In the records room. Elias's eyes settled on the fading trail disappearing into the western wilderness. If Mercer has spent years hunting one Apache family over a forgotten river, he tightened the saddle strap with quiet determination. Then whatever waits there is powerful enough to change far more than either of our lives. Far. Beyond the canyon walls, hidden by the setting sun, a lone rider watched the checkpoint through a brass spyglass. He lowered it slowly, then smiled. The necklace has surfaced, he murmured. Tell Mr. Mercer the hunt begins again. A trail could disappear beneath the wind. Guilt never did. They left the military checkpoint before sunrise. No farewell. No promises. Only the quiet sound of saddle leather creaking beneath the pale light of dawn. The desert stretched endlessly before them, painted in soft shades of amber and blue. Morning frost still clung to patches of sagebrush hidden beneath towering mesas, while distant coyotes surrendered the land to daylight with one final mournful cry. Elias rode ahead. Aiyana followed several yards behind. Not because she feared him, because neither of them knew how to walk beside a stranger carrying pieces of their past. The silver necklace rested safely beneath her shirt. Its weight felt heavier with every mile. Around noon, they reached an abandoned stagecoach station. Half the roof had collapsed years before, leaving crooked beams exposed to the endless sky. A dry well stood beside the weathered building, surrounded by broken wagon wheels and drifting tumbleweeds. Elias dismounted first. The horses need water. There isn't any. There used to be. He lowered an old bucket anyway. Several moments later, the rope stopped. A faint splash echoed from somewhere deep below. Enough for them. While the horses drank, Aiyana sat beneath the shade of a leaning cottonwood tree. She watched Elias repair a loose horseshoe with quiet concentration. You don't ask many questions. He smiled faintly without looking up. Most people answer before they're ready. You think I'll answer eventually? I think silence gets tired. She almost smiled. Almost. After a long pause, she reached beneath her shirt and held the silver necklace in her palm. My father found the river by accident. Elias stopped working. He was hunting elk. He discovered men digging. For gold. She slowly shook her head. No. What then? She looked toward the mountains shimmering beyond the desert heat. Water. Elias frowned. Water. The only year-round. River crossing hundreds of miles. He understood immediately. Not gold. Not silver. Water-controlled cattle. Farms. Railroads. Entire towns. A man who owned the only dependable river could own everything built around it. Gideon Mercer, Elias murmured. She nodded. My father refused to sell its location. So Mercer killed him. I believed that for years. Her voice became quieter. But now, She looked again at the burned letter. I'm no longer sure he acted alone. Before Elias could answer, both horses suddenly lifted their heads. Their ears turned east. A moment later, the wind carried an unfamiliar sound. Not hoofbeats. Voices. Many voices. Elias climbed the remains of the stagecoach platform and looked across the valley. Dust. Dozens of riders. Some wore cavalry blue. Others carried Apache lances decorated with eagle feathers. His heartbeat slowed instead of quickening. This was worse than an ambush. The two groups were riding toward each other. Fast. Aiyana climbed beside him. The color vanished from her face. My people. Elias followed her gaze. The Apache riders had already spotted them. One warrior raised his arm. Another pointed directly at Elias. Even from this distance, anger was unmistakable. They think you've captured me. She swallowed. And the soldiers. He looked toward the cavalry column. They think I'm helping you escape. Neither side knew the truth. Neither side was likely to ask. Within minutes, rifles and bows would be drawn. One misunderstanding. Two armies. Elias exhaled slowly. So this is how Mercer wins. Aiyana looked at him. He doesn't need to start a war. He only needs to make sure nobody listens. The distance between the two columns shrank rapidly. Shouts echoed across the valley. A frightened cavalry lieutenant lifted his saber. An Apache warrior answered by raising his bow. One nervous mistake would turn the desert into a graveyard. Elias swung himself into the saddle. What are you doing? Aiyana asked. He tightened the reins. Stopping them. By yourself. He looked toward the growing storm of men, horses, dust, fear, and generations of hatred racing toward each other. Then he removed the revolver from his belt. Instead of checking the bullets, he dropped it onto the ground. I don't think another gun is what this valley needs. With that, Elias spurred his horse forward, riding alone into the empty space between two forces already preparing to kill. Hatred could cross a valley in minutes. Trust had to ride faster. Elias urged his horse into the open ground between the two advancing lines. Dust exploded beneath pounding hooves. Behind him, Aiyana shouted his name, but the wind carried her voice away before it reached him. The cavalry slowed first. Lieutenant Harris, hardly older than 25, pulled sharply on his reins as the lone cowboy appeared directly in his path. Move, the young officer shouted. Elias did not. He simply raised one empty hand. My gun's on the ground behind me. The lieutenant frowned. What? I said. Elias spread both hands for everyone to see. I'm unarmed. Across the valley, nearly 30 Apache riders swept over the ridge like a wave of bronze and crimson. Eagle feathers danced behind braided hair. Horses thundered across the desert floor, their riders gripping bows instead of rifles. At their front rode an older warrior with silver woven into his long black hair. His hawk-like eyes locked immediately onto Aiyana. She had finally caught up. She rode hard until her horse stood beside Elias. For a heartbeat, the old warrior's stern expression softened. Aiyana. She lowered her head respectfully. Chief Takota. The relief lasted only an instant. Then Takota noticed Elias beside her. His weathered face hardened. Step away from the white man. Aiyana remained exactly where she was. He saved my life. He has bewitched your judgment. No. He wears the face of those who murdered your father. He wears his own face. The old chief's eyes narrowed. Silence settled over both groups. Every bow remained drawn. Every rifle remained ready. One frightened horse shifted sideways. A soldier tightened his finger against the trigger. Elias saw it. So did Aiyana. One accident. That was all history ever needed. Without warning, Elias swung himself down from the saddle. He walked alone into the empty ground separating both sides. Every rifle followed him. Every arrow pointed toward his chest. He stopped halfway. My name is Elias Brooks. No one answered. My father was Thomas Brooks. The name drifted across the valley. Something changed. Chief Takota's eyes flickered. You knew Thomas? I knew the man he became. The old chief slowly lowered his bow an inch. He once carried an Apache child through floodwater. Elias looked surprised. I never heard that story. He never told it? No. Takota looked toward the endless desert beyond the valley. He said kindness loses its value when a man talks too much about it. For the first time, the old warrior's voice carried sorrow instead of anger. He saved my granddaughter. Aiyana slowly turned toward Elias. You never knew. He shook his head. My father spoke very little. The silence grew deeper. Then another sound shattered it. A rifle. One single shot. Not from the cavalry. Not from the Apache. The bullet struck the ground beside Elias, throwing sand against his boots. Instinct took over. Several soldiers lifted their rifles. Apache warriors pulled bowstrings tight. No, Aiyana screamed. Another shot echoed from the cliffs. Then another. Hidden gunmen. The scarred bounty hunters had returned. They were firing from the rocks above both groups. They're trying to start the war, Elias shouted. The next bullet struck a cavalry horse. The terrified animal reared violently, throwing its rider to the ground. At the same instant, an Apache pony collapsed after another shot grazed its shoulder. Chaos spread like wildfire. Men on both sides believed they were under attack. Rifles began rising. Bows bent. Chief Takota's voice boomed across the valley. Hold! Lieutenant Harris shouted the same command. But fear was louder than either man. Elias looked toward the cliffs. There. 5 hidden rifle flashes. The bounty hunters. Mercer's men had planned every moment. Not to kill one woman. To make 2 peoples kill each other. Without hesitation, Elias sprinted toward the fallen cavalryman lying helpless in the open. The hidden rifles shifted toward him. Aiyana saw the movement before anyone else. She knew exactly what they intended. If Elias reached that wounded soldier, every gun on the ridge would fire. She kicked her horse forward with all the strength she had. Not to escape, not to save herself, but to reach Elias before the bullets did. The truth never shouted across the frontier. It waited for brave people to survive long enough to speak it. Aiyana reached Elias just as the next volley cracked from the cliffs. She threw herself from her horse. The 2 of them crashed into the sand. A bullet tore through the sleeve of Elias's coat before burying itself in the earth where his heart had been only an instant before. Dust swallowed them. Stay down, Elias whispered. I didn't ride here to watch you die. Another rifle flashed high above. This time, Chief Takota saw it. So did Lieutenant Harris. Neither man gave the order to fire. Instead, both looked toward the cliffs. The enemy was no longer standing between them. The enemy was above them. There, Aiyana shouted, pointing toward the jagged rocks. 5 silhouettes shifted behind the sandstone ledges. Mercer's gunmen. The scar-faced bounty hunter stepped into view, believing confusion would hide him one moment longer. He was wrong. Chief Takota slowly lowered his bow. Not because he intended to surrender, because he had finally seen the same target as the cavalry. Lieutenant Harris raised his hand. His soldiers hesitated. The young officer looked across the valley toward the Apache chief. Takota met his eyes. No words crossed the distance. None were needed. The lieutenant slowly pointed his saber toward the cliffs. Takota answered by raising 2 fingers. A signal. Not for war. For agreement. The valley held its breath. Then both groups moved at once. Not against each other. Together. Cavalry riders charged along the eastern slope, while Apache horsemen disappeared into narrow canyon trails only they understood. Within moments, Mercer's gunmen found themselves hunted from 2 directions instead of watching 2 armies destroy one another. The scar-faced bounty hunter realized the trap had failed. Fall back, he shouted. His men scattered. Too late. Apache riders cut off the northern escape. The cavalry blocked the southern trail. The outlaws fled deeper. Into the rocks until only one path remained. A narrow ledge overlooking the canyon. The scarred hunter stopped there, breathing heavily. He laughed. You think you've won? No one answered. He reached inside his coat. Several rifles lifted. Instead of drawing a pistol, he pulled out a thick leather ledger wrapped in oilcloth. Elias immediately recognized the silver wolf stamped across its cover. The same mark. The same symbol. The hunter smiled coldly. This book built half the territory. Then he tossed it toward the canyon below. Aiyana lunged forward instinctively. No. The ledger struck a rock, bounced once, then slid onto a narrow shelf instead of disappearing into the abyss. Elias scrambled after it, lowering himself carefully over the edge while loose stones rattled beneath his boots. His fingertips caught the leather cover just before gravity claimed it forever. He climbed back slowly, breathing hard. The ledger was heavier than it looked. Chief Takota opened the first page. Names, dates, payments, villages, land purchases, witnesses, bribes, every stolen river crossing, every burned settlement, Every hired attack blamed on Apache warriors. Every reward paid to bounty hunters. Everything. Lieutenant Harris stared in stunned silence. My God. Dakota turned another page. Thomas Brooks. The name appeared beside Aiyana's father. Not as enemies. As witnesses. Both men had signed statements refusing to sell the river's location to Gideon Mercer. The final entry carried a single instruction written in bold ink. If persuasion fails. The next words chilled every soul standing there. Create a war. Silence spread across the canyon. Years of hatred suddenly looked different. Villages had blamed soldiers. Soldiers had blamed Apache warriors. While one wealthy man quietly profited from every funeral. The scar-faced hunter backed toward the cliff's edge. You'll never reach Mercer. No. Elias answered quietly. We won't. The hunter smiled. I knew it. Elias closed the ledger. But this will. For the first time since the chase had begun, the cowboy wasn't holding a weapon. He was holding the truth. And somehow, it felt far more dangerous. Justice did not arrive with the loudest gun. It arrived on the quiet day when people finally chose to believe the truth instead of the stories they had inherited. 3 months later, the valley looked different. The smoke had disappeared. So had the fear. The leather ledger recovered from the canyon became more powerful than any rifle in the territory. Every page carried names that could not deny their own signatures. Judges who once ignored Apache testimony found themselves reading sworn statements written by white surveyors. Merchants who had accepted Gideon Mercer's gold suddenly remembered conversations they had long claimed to forget. By the first snowfall, Mercer stood before a federal court. He spoke often. The evidence spoke louder. When the verdict came, there was no cheering. Only silence. Some victories deserved respect more than celebration. The hidden river was never sold. Instead, an agreement unlike any the territory had ever seen was signed beside its banks. Apache families would protect the land. Nearby ranchers would share its water. Neither side would own the river. Both would depend upon it. Chief Dakota placed his weathered hand upon the document before passing it to Lieutenant Harris. The young officer signed without hesitation. Then he looked toward Elias. You started this. Elias smiled faintly. No. He looked across the flowing water. It started long before either of us was born. Spring returned. Wildflowers pushed through the red earth where horses had once charged toward battle. Children from the nearby settlement wandered freely along the riverbank, laughing as they skipped stones across the water. Some had fair hair. Some wore long black braids. None of them cared. To children, friendship always arrived before prejudice had the chance to introduce itself. Elias spent most mornings repairing an old wooden footbridge that floods had nearly destroyed years before. He measured each plank carefully. Hammered every nail slowly, as though building something stronger than timber. One quiet afternoon, familiar footsteps approached across the bridge. He did not turn immediately. He already knew who it was. Aiyana stopped beside him. The breeze carried the scent of cottonwood blossoms through her dark hair. For a while, neither of them spoke. The river did enough talking for everyone. She reached into a small leather pouch hanging from her belt. Inside rested the silver necklace that had brought so much sorrow. And finally, so much truth. I've been thinking, she said softly. So have I. She smiled. I know. Carefully, she placed the necklace into his weathered hands. He looked at her with quiet surprise. It belongs to your family. She gently closed his fingers around it. It belongs to both of our fathers. The words lingered between them like the evening light stretching across the water. Thomas Brooks, Aiyana's father. 2 men who had refused to sell a river. 2 men who had paid dearly for honesty. Neither had lived long enough to see the peace they had protected. But perhaps, they had always believed someone else would. Elias looked toward the bridge beneath his boots. Then beyond it, where Apache children and ranchers' sons chased one another through the tall grass, without keeping score. Slowly, he removed the necklace from his own hand. Instead of wearing it, he tied it to one of the bridge's center posts, where sunlight caught the silver each morning and travelers from either side would see it before crossing. No plaque explained its meaning. No speech honored the dead. It did not need either. Chief Dakota approached quietly from the opposite bank. Lieutenant Harris arrived moments later. The old chief removed his feathered headpiece for a brief moment. The lieutenant removed his campaign hat. Neither man spoke. Neither man apologized. They simply stood together, looking at the same river their father's generation had nearly turned into a battlefield. The wind carried the soft sound of moving water beneath the bridge. Some borders had once been drawn by fear. Others had been erased by courage. And somewhere beyond the endless western horizon, where dust met the setting sun, two forgotten fathers could finally rest, knowing that the bridge their sons and daughter built together would outlive every wall that hatred had ever raised.